Buffalo terrorist didn't shoot alone. And I think, you know, at some level, this is fairly obvious, but at another level, I think if we put it in the right frame, possibly some solutions become available to us. First of all, we need to be calling him a terrorist. Right, this guy tried to inflict maximum terror. He writes in his manifesto that he specifically chose a supermarket because he wanted black people to feel that they could be killed anywhere. So he wanted to try a new place where everybody goes. That's terrorism. And why this guy isn't being called a terrorist, why that word is not the description, why they call him the shooter, I don't get. Well, I do get. He was a white guy. I totally get it. But anyway, the weapons, he didn't act alone. The weapons industry in the United States stood right beside him. They made sure he had easy and legal access to highly profitable weapons of war that are banned or tightly regulated in every other developed democracy in the world. The Republican Party stood right beside him, taking money from that industry in exchange for blocking legislation the majority of Americans support that would regulate guns in America. Republican appointees on the Supreme Court stood right beside him, taking gifts, junkets, and speaking fees from groups associated with that weapons industry that got them on the court and lobbied their votes in the corrupt Heller decision. America's media stands right beside him, normalizing the terrorism of mass shootings by never using the word terrorist to describe white people like him, and never, ever talking about, for example, what happened in Australia after the murders in, I think it was 1996, as I recall, in Australia, that led that country to just say, okay, enough. We've talked about that in the program before. I won't revisit it right now. But also, who stood behind the shooter? The billionaires who fund the Republican Party stood right beside him, watching without a word as the same politicians that they'd initially corrupted with their dark money contributions to keep taxes and regulation low prostituted themselves to the gun industry. When the Buffalo terrorists murdered 10 people to stop the replacement of white people, he didn't act alone. The white supremacy industry, yes, it's an industry in America with a healthy fundraising and publishing arm, stood right beside him, providing him with talking points and twisted history to justify his rage. Ron DeSantis and Greg Abbott and other Republican governors around the country stood right beside him, pushing through laws to prevent the next generation of potential white terrorists he hoped to influence with his manifesto from learning the true racial history of America in our public schools. Fox News and their crew of hosts, producers, executives, and the Murdoch family stood right beside him, amplifying white people's fear that if they end up the minority in this country, they may be treated the same way that white people treated minorities for centuries. Social media companies stood right beside him, spoon-feeding him rage, fear, and hate, because those emotions are the things that tickle their algorithms and basically increase profits for these social media companies. The massive monopolistic corporations that fund the Republican Party stood right beside him, continuing to shovel money to replacement theory politicians like Elise Stefanik and Matt Gaetz. The Republican Party itself stood right beside him, having quietly invited white supremacists into their ranks in the 1970s with Nixon's Southern strategy. They doubled down on it in 1980 when Reagan's first official speech as a candidate for president of the United States was at the Nebosha or Neshoba, however you say it, County Fair near Philadelphia, Mississippi, where 3 civil rights workers, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwimmer, were murdered. And the Republican approval of racism as an overt political strategy when they refused to ostracize Trump for his primary announcement that it was Mexicans who are rapists and murderers coming to this country. And in the end, and I think this is the toughest one for those of you who are white who are listening to this program, I think white people all stand beside the Buffalo terrorist if those of us with that white privilege don't use it to push back with everything we have to rid America of the scourge of racism and the power of the big money and death-dealing industries that support it. This guy did not act alone, and I think that we need to be very, very, very clear about that. So that's my rant for today. By the way, today is also primary election day in 5 states. Here in Oregon, it's happening. It's Pennsylvania is the one that's getting most of the attention. John Fetterman is still in the hospital, but he says, and his doctors say he's going to be fine. He's got atrial fibrillation, which can cause a stroke, and is very treatable. So you know, we'll see how that shakes out. My apologies, by the way. I just wanted to say this. Yesterday, this whole issue of this shooter and the right-wing support for him, and then, you know, my getting a couple of calls from right-wingers, mostly people listening to Sirius XM. I know there's a couple of other right-wing channels there, and they'll dial across and find our channel, and calling up and saying, well, you know, it's killing people is good population control. It's a good thing for the planet. Or, you know, one person called and said, and another person saying, well, what about when black people shoot black people? And I just got so pissed off at it. I shouldn't, I'm not laughing at the situation. I'm laughing at myself, at how I essentially lost control for a few minutes there yesterday. And I wanted to apologize to you for that. I'm generally a little tighter than that. And